this episode, we're going to tackle the influence of Ayn Rand on comic book culture and anti-fascism and how it's represented. I'm only going to do a very small thing on Rand herself, her biography and philosophy, and then we'll get right into Spider-Man and her impact. Well, Rand is a very curious case. She was born in Russia, and she grew up during the Bolshevik Revolution. Her family is wealthy, but not very wealthy, but she's very well educated and, again, comes from a very cultured background. So the Bolsheviks take over. Now, there was real repression. I don't want to in any way deny that, but her case is actually kind of interesting because her family wasn't killed. It was definitely repressed. What they did was they stole the property of her family. But in an interesting twist, they did pay for her education. So Rand grows up and is very influenced by Nietzsche's work and his work on individualism. But she wants to go a lot further, and of course the Bolsheviks kind of radicalize her. So she manages to get out of Russia. In fact, she uses the education she got from the Bolsheviks. But, that's fine. It's fine that, they sort of took something from her and she used them in a way. And she lands in Hollywood and changes her name. Ayn Rand is not her real name. And she slowly develops her philosophy, which she calls objectivism, which is that there are no subjective values. There are only objective values everywhere. There are objective values in science, objective values in ethics, and objective values in politics. And she slowly, through her fiction and nonfiction, develops this point of view, and it matures, of course, in the 1950s in her series of novels, especially Atlas Shrugged. So it has a major impact on a lot of intellectuals, especially New York intellectuals. And one of them is Steve Ditko. If you don't know who Ditko is literally the co-creator of Spider-Man. While people credit Stan Lee, basically Spider-Man is the co-creation of Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. And Ditko is a really hardcore follower of Ayn Rand. And with Rand's philosophy, she has an interesting take on how you can do fiction, but her belief is that fiction has to be rational. It cannot allow any irrational values into it. So, for instance, zombies. If you like drawing zombies, you can't do it anymore because Rand does not consider, supernaturalism or God to be rational, so you can't draw zombies. And, of course, Spider-Man is an interesting in-between case because his powers are natural, right? He just gains them through radioactivity. So, for a while, Ditko does not have a major conflict between his work and his ideology. But it soon starts to get very extreme. So he creates this character called Mr. A. And Mr. A's thing is essentially there is no ambiguity between good and evil. Good and evil exist objectively. You choose to be good or you choose to be evil. And all he does is punish people who are evil and, of course, protect people who are good. Now, that might seem obvious in more superhero origins and things like that, but you have to understand there are hard cases where, of course, right, a hero will act unheroically and a villain will act heroically. And we take that for granted, right? There are going to be situations where it's really hard to tell. And Rand and Ditko insist, no, there are no ambiguous cases. There will never be a time you will have to really think about choosing between good and evil. Good and evil are there. You either choose one or the other. Period. There is no ambiguity. So one of the readers of Ditko, among the many millions, is Alan Moore, who eventually writes Watchmen. And the character of Rorschach is based partly on Mr. A. In fact, physically and visually, they're very similar. And Rorschach himself adopts this. There is no ambiguous, decisions between good and evil. But here's a twist, is that Rorschach is actually fascist, right? Rorschach actually espouses a very fascist ideology and a fascist way of thinking. But he pushes it to such an extreme. So he's willing to punish people who are evil and protect people who are good, but he does so while embracing a very fascist ideology. Now, he's not like the comedian. The comedian is a completely violent thug. He only cares about himself. But Rorschach is, in a very weird sense, he does care about other people. So he's very close to the edge with Rand, right? Because Rand does not allow any altruism in any real sense. But Rorschach also has this very strong patriotic nationalist ideology. However, he does not believe in the government. So it's sort of this very weird mix of vigilantism and fascism and his way of being. And I think Moore's point here is that even though, in a superficial sense, Rand's work is anti-fascist, right? She does not endorse authoritarianism either on the left or the right. Because she pushed it to such an extreme, you can end up in a case where you are, quote, anti-fascist, but for all intents and purposes, you end up with fascism nevertheless. And Rorschach is this kind of difficult case where you sympathize a little bit with what he's doing in terms of his crusade. On the other hand, he doesn't really in any way, become an anti-fascist. He actually embraces imperialism, sexism, and racism, but he does it in his own way, right? He does it in a kind of non-statist, individualist way. So it brings up an interesting question whether individualism and fascism are compatible. In a weird sense, again, it's a very rare case, but it actually can be. So even though Rand is an individualist and is anti-fascist in effect, there are seeds where her work can become very authoritarian if it's not examined closely. So it's an interesting case, and again, you have to be careful. Moore is very much on the left. He's a little biased, but I do think he brings up a valid point of how these are murky, kind of isms. We think individualism will always be against fascism, but there can be ways that individualism and fascism hook up with one another. All right, this has been a look at Steve Ditko as a Randian philosopher in comic culture. Partially examined Kubrick. If you like the content, please hit the like button and/or subscribe. Please share the content. Please hit the like button if you can.